Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this book launch. I'm Benjamin Rode. I'm a senior fellow at the ISS and editor of our Adelphi book series, and I'm delighted to be chairing the launch of our newest Adelphi book, which is Cyber Operations and Their Responsible Use, written by Marcus Willett and published today. And ISS members, of course, receive a free copy of the book. If you're not fortunate enough to already be an ISS member, then all participants here will later receive an email with a 20% discount code to purchase the book at Routledge. It's also available to buy on Amazon, either in hard copy or on your Kindle. And there are, I should say, copies of the book available for purchase here today at the back with credit or debit card at the discounted 20% price off. The first thing I need to do is thank Marcus himself for this book, which I think has been a real labor of love and has turned into something I think is extremely impressive. It was a real pleasure to work with him and to bring it into the world. And I certainly learned a lot more about cyberspace, and I hope this will be the experience of everyone reading it too. I need to thank a number of other colleagues, including Julia Vu and Natalia Canejo in the Cyber Power and Future Conflict Programme for their extensive support for this project, as well as a large number of ISS teams in editorial, design, communications, and events, especially the designer of the lovely book cover, Jill Williams, and most of all, Associate Editor Alice Averson, who is with us over there today. And I'd also like to recognise in the audience today our Executive Chairman, Sir John Chipman, who first suggested to Marcus, actually, that he'd be ideally placed to write this book. So thank you, John. Marcus will first speak for maybe about 15 minutes or so to introduce the book's main themes and arguments. We'll then go to Q&A. A little bit of housekeeping ahead of the Q&A for our online audience who are joining us from around the world. Please type any questions or comments you might have into the chat function below you on Zoom. And I should also note that this meeting is on the record. Let me now introduce the author. And in a 33-year career at GCHQ, Marcus Willett, CB OBE, rose to become its deputy head, with personal responsibility for, amongst other things, all GCHQ cyber operations. Previously, he was GCHQ's first director cyber and led the UK National Offensive Cyber Programme. He also held senior posts across the wider UK intelligence and security community. And since 2018, he's been a senior advisor here for cyber at the ISS, and he's been advising government policymakers as well as private companies in the UK, US, and elsewhere. Marcus is currently working full-time on leading a cross-government review for the Cabinet Office, not specifically related to cyber. And I should perhaps also say that on top of all that, he's a professional musician at a high level. His previous publications include articles on the SolarWinds hack, the Ukraine war, and a methodology for measuring the cyber power states. Marcus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And of course, massive thanks to you who sort of led me by the hand through this whole process and kept me going, absolutely invaluable. And also Alice for some fantastic copy editing, saving the day. Look, yes, it's going to be approximately 15 minutes, I'm going to cover why I wrote the book, what we mean by cyber operations, an outline of what the book covers, why the topic is important, and a sample of the book's key conclusions. Then we can have a decent amount of time for some Q&A. So I hope you're getting ready for that. So first off, why I wrote the book. As Ben said, I've had a long career working on cyber-related issues in government, including the running of cyber operations, so plenty of practical experience. I've also had the opportunity since leaving government service 6 years ago to further research how governments, the private sector, and the third sector are viewing the broad subject of cyber. All of that has led to a frustration that many policy and decision makers are still viewing cyber as purely a technical subject to be left to technical people. And I'm seeing it again now that I'm temporarily back in the government world. Many are still not grasping that actions undertaken via cyberspace have implications for every issue they might care about. People's day-to-day lives, the functioning of governments and companies, critical national services such as agriculture, food distribution, banking, healthcare, transport, water supply and energy, and the global economy itself, countering criminality, national and collective defence, and national and collective security, to name a few. All are fundamentally dependent on being able to safely and securely use cyberspace, by which I mean the internet, intranets, the overall digital or online environment, whichever phrase you want to choose. it ought to be obvious. It probably is to all of you, but it still isn't widespread. It is in that context that we need to understand better what cyber operations really are, their perceived and actual utility, their attendant risks, and how the risks can be mitigated or managed. In other words, how cyber operations can be used responsibly. Put yet another way, how do liberal democracies use and run cyber operations compared with how they are used and run by other states? Because I think there are, and should be, some important differences. With that aim in mind, I've tried to create a primer on cyber operations to serve as a point of reference for people in government, the corporate world, the third sector, and wider public. It is meant to help by adding to and complementing what has already been written on behalf of governments by the UK's National Cyber Force, for example. It is also meant to challenge governments to say more. They need to. So, what are we actually talking about? I need to spend a couple of minutes clarifying what we mean by cyber operations, what they are not, and why the difference matters. By cyber operations, I mean operations in cyberspace that are principally intended to deliver an effect rather than gather intelligence or provide goal line protection, cybersecurity, to devices and networks. In my career, the labeling of these types of operations has been a journey. They started out as computer network attack, as opposed to computer network exploitation, which meant intelligence gathering, or computer network defense, an element of cybersecurity. They were added to by the term computer network information operations, with both terms later combined to become offensive cyber. There are problems with each of these, and so, like the Tallinn Manual, which covers the application of international law to actions taken in cyberspace, and the most recent UK National Cyber Strategy, I've settled on cyber operations. There is much more on that etymological journey in the book. But 5 important points follow. First, there is a complex relationship between cyber operations, intelligence gathering, and cybersecurity. For example, intelligence gathering and ensuring operational security are often important phases of cyber operations. And if we just take hacking, it can often be hard to distinguish between activity designed to collect intelligence and that designed to deliver an effect, at least until the effect is delivered. Sometimes the only clue until that point is the nature of the target. Second, people often equate cyber operations with the delivery of destructive and disabling effects. That is certainly part of it, but as used by states in competition, crisis, and conflict, by far their most prevalent use has been for subtler cognitive and psychological effects, to change how a target thinks, feels, or behaves by planting, altering, or amplifying information to influence, mislead, confuse, or deceive an individual, a group, a state's decision makers, or even an entire society. This is a subset of cyber operations that I and many others label cyber-enabled information operations, and is why thinking about cyber operations is often distorted by analogies with weapons and arms control. And going further, it should be noted that in peace or war, the use by states of cyber operations of all sorts is probably surpassed in scale by the use of cyberspace for intelligence gathering. Third, but understanding the difference between cyber operations and cyber intelligence gathering really matters. If a government department is hacked and national secrets stolen, it is an act of espionage with certainly security implications, but is not an internationally wrongful act. It is not a coercive intervention, it's not a use of force, it's not an attack. Spying is an accepted norm of international behaviour, notwithstanding the fact that how it is achieved and its scale and intrusiveness might demand a response, such as the expelling of embassy officials. But you wouldn't want to go to war because you've been spied on. Whereas the use of hacking to disable a country's energy grid is fundamentally different, justifying a range of robust responses under international law. Fourth, it is the effect of a cyber operation that matters under international law, not the fact that it was undertaken via cyberspace. Taking an admittedly extreme example purely to illustrate the point, the triggering of collective defence under NATO's Article 5, It was the destruction, death, and terror caused by the attacks on the Twin Towers that caused its invoking, rather than the fact that hijacked aircraft were the means. It is the same sort of calculation that would need to be made when judging whether a cyber operation might ever entail the invoking of Article 5. Fifth, there is more to cyber operations than hacking, by which I mean the unauthorized insertion of code, software into a device, system, or network to achieve something on or to it. A cyber operation can also involve the overwhelming of a device or network with such a flood of traffic that it can no longer function. Or a cyber operation can involve developing a false but credible online persona and using it to gain the trust of and influence the behavior of a target. In this book, I am somewhat controversially including the use of false personas en masse, using botnets and trolls for the deliberate and covert online dissemination or amplification of false information, i.e. disinformation operations, to indiscriminately target whole societies, as practiced by certain states. This certainly falls within my definition of cyber operations, and we would do well to think of it in that way, even though the types of defensive responses would need to differ from those used to defend against other sorts of cyber operations. I'm very happy to discuss that in question and answer. So what does the book actually cover? As well as defining cyber operations, I outline the short history of their use by states and non-state actors, including the Russia-Ukraine war, as a case study, drawing conclusions for their perceived strategic utility, highlighting their attendant risks and how they might be better managed, therefore setting out a framework for their responsible use. And in that context, examining in detail how they are run by the UK. And finally, looking at what emerging technologies, including but not only artificial intelligence, might mean for their future. So why is the topic important? I've already alluded to part of this earlier in my talk. Going further, I am maintaining that the very complexity of cyber operations, or concentrating on only certain of their aspects, or careless analogies, each risks distorting a key point. Cyber operations are game-changing for many of the real-world effects that states and private actors have long wanted to achieve. This is because actions taken in cyberspace allow individuals, groups, and governments to do things to other individuals, groups, and governments at a speed, scale, persistence, and geographic reach unachievable via any other medium or domain. This includes the ability to reach in, touch, and affect the levers of power of states during peace and war. Just look at what private actors have been doing to both Ukraine and Russia via cyberspace during that war. Many states and non-state actors have realized this, whether through the use of disabling cyber operations or cyber-enabled information operations. And incidentally, cyberspace has also revolutionized spying. For example, North Korea and Iran seem to have realized that cyber operations offer them perhaps their only realistic opportunity of affecting the homeland security of a superpower like the United States. While for criminals, the disruptive use of ransomware, definitely a type of cyber operation, has become their means of choice for making money. It has by far outstripped real-world criminality, especially that undertaken for financial gain. But that game-changing nature of cyberspace and the means and methods being developed for cyber operations also come with significant risks. For example, if cyber operations, including those supporting information operations, go wrong or are deliberately used recklessly, the impact can also happen at an unequaled speed, scale, persistence, and global reach, with profound implications for national and global security, for the safe and secure use of the internet, and for the trust that can be placed in the information and data we need to pull from it. The risk is only exacerbated by the intended or accidental proliferation of dangerous cyber capabilities, resulting in a low cost of entry for any aspiring actor, cyber actor, and with a worrying nexus developing between state and non-state, including criminal cyber actors. None of this is helped by the misperception that states can get away with undertaking cyber operations without being attributed. or thinking that even if they are conclusively attributed, that real-world legal thresholds do not apply because it is just cyberspace, or not understanding how the thresholds do apply, and therefore not understanding the risks entailed of triggering a real-world escalation. This is why any responsible state that develops and uses cyber operations must find ways of dealing with these associated risks. I include the detail and propose a framework for acting responsibly in cyberspace in the book. What are my key conclusions? The short answer, understandably favoured by my IISS sponsors and my publishers, with a massive thank you to both for their part in enabling the creation of this Adelphi, is of course read the book. But here it is a necessarily brief taster given the time. And again, there's a theme here, it's 5 points. First, the short history of cyber operations has taught states that despite their game-changing nature, they can rarely achieve a decisive strategic effect by themselves. Whether in peace or war, such operations have greatest utility when integrated into campaigns utilizing a wide range of a state's national capabilities, for example, economic, diplomatic, and legal. Second, it is difficult to judge when and whether advances in digital technology, such as artificial intelligence and quantum, might give an advantage to either the attacker or the defender, but it will probably even out over time, while in the meantime, adding further layers of opportunity, first mover advantage, complexity, and risk to the running of operations. But in the right hands, also providing the ability to run operations more responsibly. Third, when it comes to the destructive and disabling types of cyber operation, there's been a great commentating sport over the years in exaggerating the extent of their use by states and the sort of effects they can achieve, including whether they might even act as a strategic deterrent. This has more recently been counteracted by a considerable downplaying by commentators of their potential effectiveness. The truth lies somewhere in between, with, I contend, more danger lying in underestimating than overestimating the potential effectiveness of cyber operations. I believe that states, whether in competition, crisis, or conflict, have realized that disabling cyber operations offer a means of what we might call behind the lines clandestine sabotage across a whole swathe of a country's critical infrastructure, quickly, simultaneously, repeatedly, and potentially from anywhere on the globe. Widespread cyber sabotage is what Russia has attempted against Ukraine, both before and after the invasion. And to remove the avoidance of doubt, it is happening almost daily in plain sight, given the widespread disruption caused by the criminal use of ransomware. Just take a look at what cyber criminals did to Costa Rica and Indonesia. This technique is already being copied by a few states, mostly for its disruptive effect rather than for financial gain, and gives an indication of what many states could be capable of if push were to come to shove. Fourth, I contend that, contrary to popular belief, deterrence does play out in cyberspace, but in ways that we do not yet fully comprehend, and depending on what type of activity is meant to be deterred. This is because there are dynamics between cyberspace and the real world that are still evolving. Fifth, and finally, approximately 50 minutes. Currently, certain liberal democratic states enjoy some crucial capability and operational advantages over their authoritarian counterparts. Their principal edge is their proven ability to operate together in alliances of differing combinations on collective intelligence gathering, but now expanded to include collective cyber operations, as well as their ability to signal collective attributions of the cyber operations of others. It helps that arguably the world's most cyber-capable state, the United States, is one of their number. The liberal democracies also seem well-placed to seize an advantage by being the quickest to adopt and adapt to the newest developments in technology, including for running and defending against cyber operations. And also given the opportunities they have to slow the ability of certain authoritarian states to themselves adopt and adapt. Just think about the control of the export of advanced semiconductors, microchips, for example. Nevertheless, when it comes to China, there are increasingly fine margins that mean that the liberal democratic edge is far from being guaranteed into even the near future. It should also be noted that the widespread and bold, some would say reckless, day-to-day use of cyber operations, including cyber-enabled information operations by certain authoritarian states, is giving them a wealth of operational experience beyond that of the liberal democratic states, which will count for something. That said, I contend that given the cyber operations of liberal democracies must be responsible by design, given they are democratically authorized and controlled, and therefore, if found to be irresponsible, open to domestic and international legal, news media, scientific and academic challenge, and held to public account, all means that they are more likely to evolve and adapt in line with real-world pressures, be they political, military, economic, or technological, than perhaps those run by the other states. Historically, liberal democracies learn quicker. But all of that depends on their respective domestic audiences and stakeholders having an understanding of the foundational concepts of cyber operations. That's what this book is meant to help with. That's it. Now we're open for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for that excellent overview and synopsis of really a very meaty and kind of densely written and rich book. So I encourage you all to read the full book to get the full experience. But nonetheless, that was a heroic and very impressive synopsis. We're going to be taking questions in the audience. My colleague Lily is going to be coming around with a microphone. The first question will be from Sir John Shipman here in the front row.
Well, Marcus, first, congratulations. Thank you very much for creating what I hope will be seen as the classic and seminal work on this subject. My question is about your conclusion number 2, which is if the liberal democracies were to gain first mover advantage in applying AI to their cyber operations, how could they be certain that they would be doing so responsibly? And would only being a second mover ensure that one would be able to responsibly operate in AI-enabled activity?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. First movers on the use of artificial intelligence, and this also applies to quantum technologies, that there's more likelihood they'll be used responsibly, and they'll probably be more focused on defending the use of artificial intelligence to help secure and protect against the operations of others. But I also contend that these technologies, and I mentioned it when I went through, enable states to be, there's less excuse for not being responsible, put it that way. These technologies will allow a more sophisticated ability to survey the environment and get the situational awareness about the interconnectedness of the sorts of targets that might be the legitimate targets they might be going after, how an effect might spread beyond those targets and impact unintended targets, collateral damage. These technologies will allow a much better ability to understand how those effects might affect others you don't intend to hit. And that's how I would expect liberal democracies to employ those technologies when they're using cyber operations.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I have a number of questions here, but I actually want to first go to a couple online. And before I do, I should answer one of them initially that I should have said first, which is that there will be a recording of this event, which will be made available to IRSS members, I think in about 48 hours from now. The first online question is from my colleague, Julia Vu, who leads our cyber and future conflict program based in Singapore. It says, thank you very much, Marcus. You mentioned disinformation falls within the scope of your definition of cyber operations. It's hard to imagine that principles of responsibility also apply to disinformation operations. And I'm thinking of those disinformation operations that have been identified on social media platforms by adversaries. How can disinformation operations be conducted responsibly? Could you please say a little bit more about that?
Yes. I've run cyber-enabled information operations, and I know the sort of thinking we went through in trying to work out what the unintended effects and collateral damage of running an information operation might be. That all sounds very theoretical. Okay, so if you were going to break the trust within a terrorist group using information operations, you would try and calculate what that group would do as a result, and what the potential would be for violence on people who were not part of that group, or might be. You go through that sort of thinking. I've been through that sort of thinking. If you apply that more broadly, you start to, I contend, differentiate between information operations that are carefully targeted against specific individuals and specific groups to achieve very specific effects, as opposed to in peacetime. When you get into war, there are perhaps different thresholds and different criteria. But in a period of competition, peacetime, whether it's responsible to try and destabilize whole societies without properly understanding the effects that could be caused by you doing that, that's what I mean by something that I would define as an irresponsible information operation. So it's very early days in thinking about these sorts of things, but I think we need to. It's why I've included these sorts of operations in cyber operations, to try and trigger more thinking about something, as we all know, is happening all the time. And I think we need a bit more of the foundational concepts of how we should approach these subjects, and how we would draw a line between certain types of operations and others, particularly drawing a distinction for everybody on the sorts of operations that we might run and the sorts of operations that others might run.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I'm going to take one more question online and then do another sweep of the room. We have a question from Richard Harknett, who says, Marcus, congratulations on the book from the USA, and thank you for dialing in so early from the United States. The precision of definition and application of it will be influential. Can I draw you out to say more on the following? Cyber operations are game changers due to speed, scale, scope, and persistence. Could you speak a bit more about the persistence variable as impactful? Is part of this that, unlike other means, cyber effects can occur over time cumulatively without the other side knowing? Thank you.
Well, hello, Richard. And of course, the short answer is read Richard's book on persistence theory, which he wrote with Emily and others. I think that book, which I have cited in the book I write, is really sets out how that ability to reach in and touch another state with a drip of, I think what that book calls fait accompli, different things happening to your networks, different things happening to influence you, different intelligence operations, different positioning of capabilities, can over time start to affect security calculations being made by the states being targeted, with profound effects on how they're thinking. And and one of the things I get to in the book, which is to go that step further when I talk about deterrence. Applying deterrence theory to the use of cyber operations, I enjoyed doing it, and you can read about it in the book. But there's an element of deterrence theory about creating ambiguity, decision-making ambiguity, and I am struck by the way that that sort of persistent activity happening across networks in ways that you may not be able to predict, affecting, your ability to make decisions, could of itself have a deterrent effect. And I think that's something I'd love to talk to Richard more about, and you can read about it in the book. But it's one of the conclusions I came to around deterrence. I don't know if I properly answered the question, but it's a bit of a cheeky one, Richard, because it's about your book, mate.
Thank you, Marcus. The next person on my list is Paul Fraioli, just over there, editor of strategic comments at ISS.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Marcus, for the book, which will be an important resource in my own work at the Institute. I have a question that it relates to technological development in both China and the United States as they pertain to cyber operations. So in the last section of the book, you describe the implications of developments in artificial intelligence and in quantum technologies for cyber operations. And you point out that if countries have roughly equivalent capabilities in those domains, the offense-defense balance is more or less stable. If you look at the technological situation today, which is not at an endpoint, but at a sort of development point, China seems to be making investments in quantum technologies in ways that are asymmetrical to the US. They're pursuing a lot of directions that US researchers don't think are that promising, but it might have spillover effects in terms of quantum communications, which I think is agreed to be quite important. On the converse side, artificial intelligence, US firms and the government seems perhaps more interested in fundamental foundational model development, chatbot development. There's a little bit, I think, of a resistance on the Chinese side, more interest in operationalizing LLMs. But if you play this out, if you can imagine a scenario in which China has some advantages in quantum communications, the US has some advantages in AI and large language models, what might that mean for the sort of cyber operations balance in perhaps the future in 5 years, say? Thank you.
Yes, so I think the points you make about quantum communications are very interesting. You even as you've described it there, you could see how I've sort of portrayed it as maybe getting ahead in one technology and then others catching up. But you're sort of talking about two different speeds in different technologies and how they might balance each other. And I think that advantage around having an advantage around artificial intelligence countered by an advantage around quantum communications, I find intriguing. It depends what you mean by quantum communications. And I go into the book, there are many different, do you mean quantum safe communications? So the ability to protect your communications against quantum computing, or do you mean the ability to use the features of quantum mechanics to communicate? They're different things. But I think the forgotten bit in all of, in the way you phrase the question, and I worry that it's being forgotten by governments, including in this country, is quantum computing. And the investment required to seed the massive opportunities that are there. And for those of us that have hovered around quantum technologies for a while, we'll be aware that sometimes the speed of what's going to happen has been, can be exaggerated. But this is now turned into a narrative that says they're always going to happen in a decade. They're always going to happen in a decade. And what strikes me in doing the research for this book and also working with some of the very exciting startup community that are clustered around centers of academic excellence in various countries, the UK, the US, and elsewhere, there are exciting developments going on there, and things might happen quicker than people might think. In the book, you know, I used an analogy which said it could be apocryphal, but at Bletchley Park, the leaders of Bletchley Park told Winston Churchill that there was no way they'd be able to find a way around the Enigma codes. It wasn't possible. Unfortunately, they forgot to tell their staff, and so there's part of me that thinks, you know, that there's that leadership thing going around quantum that's saying, oh, it's going to be decades away, and meanwhile, there are people working, you know, assiduously. I think states need to wake up to what's at stake here. That quantum computing is a revolutionary type of capability. And also, you shouldn't think of it in isolation, that the combination of quantum computing and artificial intelligence in the next however many years, it will give pretty fundamental capabilities. I won't go into any detail, and you probably all know what's at stake here. But I mean, the most obvious one that people talk about is quantum computing can defeat all the current encryption that is present on internets and used by states to protect their communications. And you know, communications collected have an intelligence value for probably about 50 years. So just imagine what that's going to mean for a state that first develops quantum computing. So it's interesting that the Chinese are putting so much effort into quantum communications, quantum safe communications. Well, I think they're also, I think what they're mainly doing is using the features of quantum mechanics to enable them to communicate.
Thank you, Marcus. I've got a couple more people. The next person on my list is Dana Allen, editor of Survival here at the Institute, and senior fellow.
Marcus, thanks. That was really an excellent presentation. I have a question. You identified information operations and cognitive operations as the most pervasive form. And my question is about judging effects, because how do you distinguish the effects of these kind of operations from the general transformation of media, social media, the replacement of editors with algorithms? I mean, you know, the specific example is, you know, U.S. intelligence agencies, I think for 3 general elections in a row, have issued very dire warnings about Russian efforts to influence the elections. But there were those efforts, but what is, how can you, you know, what use does warning against this have in, let's say, a general sea of bad information, or at least?
When there might be all that bad information going on, and what the disinformation operations are doing is just amplifying, you know, spreading. So for as long as I've been involved in information operations, that question has been asked. How do you measure their effect? I've sat around tables in Cabinet Office trying to explain that it's not straightforward, it's very hard to do. You can use certain indicators, and that's going on today. That there is no simple answer. It's one of the sorts of things some of these new technologies might help us to be able to do better. All I can say is that the easiest thing is to show certain examples where you know a particular operation has had a particular effect, and extrapolate from that to work out what the wider effect might be. But it's very, very hard. There is no simple methodology for how you measure the effect of an information operation, as opposed to, I better be careful what I say, as opposed to the people who the information operations are aimed at doing the job themselves.
Thank you, Marcus. There's a gentleman right at the back there who had a question, who's now looking around. Yes, just in front of you. Yeah, just there. No, sorry, just here. Sorry, I meant there. The guy waving his hand there. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Joe Devaney, War Studies at King's. Congratulations, Marcus, on the book. So looking forward to it for a long time and can't wait to read it. My question is about the relationship between efforts to improve the responsibility of cyber operations through the multilateral cyber diplomacy process and the factors that you, I can't wait to read, but presumably cover in the book. So it sort of strikes me that there isn't necessarily a close connection between the responsible state behavior in cyberspace sort of normative process and identifying factors like responsible approaches to engineering in cyber operations or choice of operational infrastructure or target selection. And I just wonder what you think the prospects are for the diplomatic process to influence some of those norms of responsible behavior in cyber operations, or maybe following a different approach, the opportunities of the domain itself and the dynamics of competition in the domain sort of shaping tacit norms about responsible and irresponsible operations.
Yeah, so some of the things you've talked about there are what I mean, how you select targets, how you ensure operations are proportionate, necessary, discriminate, humane, the sort of controls you put in place to ensure that, how you monitor the effects of cyber operations throughout their duration, how you are able, therefore, to know if something's going wrong, that you can do something about it. All these sorts of things are what I mean and are in the framework. So to join up your question about that, the norms, there is no norm specifically about the running of cyber operations. There are norms that point to sort of targets that might be off limits. And there's a lot of norms about cybersecurity. Confidence building measures are there as well. What I worry about, so there's something about the running of cyber operations sort of implied by some of the stuff around targets. And it means something. What they basically say is that this would really upset us if an adversary did it to us. Implication, we wouldn't do it, but it's not said. And that's fine for diplomats and lawyers, but I wonder if the general public realise that's what it's meant. And so I think there is room for a new norm of behaviour around how states run their own cyber operations. It's a big gap, and in my book, I'm proposing that should happen. Does that make sense? Yeah. Good.
There's a lady in the penultimate row there.
Hi, Miriam Howe from BAE Systems. Well done, Marcus. Congratulations. Can't wait to read the book. Actually, that last point raised by Joe teed up my question, which was really around the international input and I guess like-mindedness of what we're talking about here. So I was reading that you had a lot of international reviews and comments, which is great, from other governments. I'm very interested in your experience and observations of having researched and the input that you were able to get on what is quite still a very sensitive topic that is not easy for people to talk about on behalf of their states. And particularly thinking about, I guess, your core premise, which is the ambiguity and the different frames of reference is really part of the core problem, both in terms of defining cyber operations, but also defining something as subjective as responsible.
Yes, so I think different states on different parts of the journey, and therefore different levels of understandably, for what we mean by cyber operations. And sometimes a surprise that somebody with my background is willing to stand up and talk about cyber operations run by the UK. The main thing I think I'm trying to convey is to international partners is, first, we need to talk about these sorts of things for all the normative reasons we've just been talking about, but also there are ways of talking about them without revealing things that, you know, for understandable reasons you might not want to reveal. So I think a really important point to make around this book is that everything I've put in it is out there in the open domain. It's informed by my background, but there's an awful lot of information out there about cyber operations run by different states. So putting it all together from all of that is what, frankly, anybody could do. I found the perspectives of other countries, as always, highly illuminating. There is a moment in the book where I do point out that there's just a tendency for Brits and the US to come over as we know all the answers and we're telling you what they are. So that is definitely not the case, and I've learned as much about cyber operations from international partners who are not US, who are not Five Eyes. Certainly, we've had our cyber distress relieved in the past by certain European international partners, for example. So I don't want to give that impression. I think, nevertheless, the statement that was made in 2023 by the UK's National Cyber Force about how it sets about running cyber operations was a first. It's pretty unique still in terms of a state actually setting out what it was doing. It was while I was writing the book, so there was a moment where I was encouraging states to do it, and then oh no, they've actually done it. Oh dear, there goes that recommendation. But I obviously worked with them at the time, and I think it goes a certain way. My book is intended to complement that and encourages them and others to go further. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I've wandered around it.
I think you have, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
There are various questions, but the next one is Nigel Davis here in the second row, our Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia.
Congratulations on a formidable achievement, and I very much look forward to reading it over the Christmas break. I have a question about the domestic implications for us and other democracies of developing effective cyber defenses against the use of the forms of cyber power you laid out by our adversaries. And you drew attention to the extraordinary scope and scale of the threats that cyber power presents, both in espionage, in the cognitive effects, and in the direct destructive effects. Now, all of us, public, corporate, private actors, store information, we consume information online, and more things are connected to the Internet of Things. Given, therefore, the scale of our potential vulnerability, what are the implications of that for the state's relationship, our democratic state's relationship with our own society and our own economy? Is there some reordering or some new and different way that the state, we all have to think about the state's relationship with us in order that collectively we are effectively protected?
So it's a really interesting question. Firstly, to just draw a distinction between the different types of cyber operation, so there's probably a different answer around the effects of information operations and how you might protect a society against those, around the digital literacy of your your citizens, and how, as well as how you can kite mark information as you're putting it out on the internet to try and distinguish between what's real and what's fake. And there's been some very interesting developments going on. But park that one for a while. In terms of the more traditional cybersecurity, stopping people intruding into your networks and having a go at your information, stealing it or altering it or whatever. What I say in the book, which is very obvious to those people who are immersed in cybersecurity, is that doing basic stuff, if you're a company, if you're a government, or if you're a private citizen, makes a fundamental difference. And if you just look at how Ukraine has gone about defending itself against a very capable cyber actor like Russia, there's still that people need to understand that doing basic stuff, doing your phishing training, doing your patching, getting somebody in to audit your approach if you're a company or a government, a third party, can stop something like, people argue about these sorts of figures, but something like 90% of the stuff that's going to hit you can be prevented by just doing basic cyber security. And if you accept that as a fact, what about the 10%? And that's all around planning for recovery and ensuring you are resilient. And again, there's some nice examples from the Ukraine war and how the Ukraine thought about those sorts of things and its ability to recover from having its energy grid taken out, within hours rather than weeks and months, and how it's mirrored critical data in cloud storage out of country. That's where a country has thought about its resilience. So I think the answer to your question is it's not as perhaps revolutionary or difficult to do as we might think, because we sort of know what to do. Everybody knows what to do. It's just finding the investment and the will to actually do it. So it's not a statement of gloom. You look at the examples where significant damage has been done to bits of critical infrastructure or government service or whatever, but in the end came down to a failure to keep up to date with patching. This isn't a story of doom and despair. It's an encouragement just to do the basics, because they really can stop a lot of this stuff.
Thank you, Marcus. We've only got a few minutes left. I've got a couple more questions which I'm going to take in a group. I should say we've also got lots of other online questions and comments. Unfortunately, I won't be able to turn to most of them, but I will ensure that Marcus sees all of them before he leaves. I should also say that my colleague Julia Vu is very correctly reminding me to remind our audience that the ISS actually produces a cyber power matrix, which tracks all publicly attributed cyber operations and disinformation operations, as well as ownership of physical cyberspace. So I encourage you all to turn to that resource. There's a gentleman here, and I'll take his question, and then I think we'll turn to Irina Mia for the final question.
Thank you. Basha I just finished a master's degree at International Peace and Security at King's College. Congrats, Marcus, for the book, and I look forward to seeing more of the insights there. I'd like to ask a question in regards to the thought of cybersecurity and cyber operations position to the rules-based world order, since you mentioned about the liberal democracies. We often tend to forget that the cyberspace is a space with very little sovereignty, right? It's still a very loose tatters space with very little sense of governance in there. And equally, the rules-based world order itself is a very much contested concept with the several factions you mentioned in your book as well. So it begs the question really, do you think a framework regulating cyber defense and automation, or cybersecurity in general then, will ever be effective, or is it still too early to say? Thank you.
Marcus,
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Marcus, for this book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I had just one quick question on the nexus you mentioned between criminal groups and state. I was just wondering whether you could expand a little bit on that, maybe give us some examples. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about, you mentioned what some people refer to as cyber sovereignty. I'm just trying to understand what you're suggesting. Are you suggesting that perhaps there ought to be different sorts of international treaties around sovereign control of bits of cyberspace?
So, yeah, just keeping in mind, for instance, 30 years ago, the UN signed a convention against those references as a framework in order to deter any, blanket race references. And as we're still at early stages of detrimental or digital cyber attacks, or the scenarios you probably quite bad at, but do you think a framework of that sort, or a convention protocol, would effectively be, could deliver some more control regulation?
Yeah. So as you know, I think the world is divided on that matter between states that think there should be more control over their sovereign cyberspace. That's what states like China and Russia think. Liberal democracies instead prefer a free, open and secure internet so that information can travel more freely, and believe that the best way of regulating is to apply existing international law, that nothing new is needed. I think that's being tested, if I'm honest. I think some policies of Western governments run slightly counter to that ideal. If you think about some of the controls being put on bits of Chinese technology, I understand some of the reasons, but that starts to feel a bit more like cyber sovereignty. So does some of the controls that are being put around data and where it's hosted. So I think there is a slight tension at the moment between the two ideals there, and I guess the point I would make is not to forget that prize of that free, open, but secure internet, because it's worth keeping in mind. But if international treaties are needed, and by the way, there have been international treaties around cyber criminality, obviously the Budapest Convention, and there's another one that's going through at the moment. It's best to realize in time to be able to lead that work and shape that work, than be the people who are gainsaying it and saying you don't want it for this reason or that reason, because that doesn't look good in what we might call the middle ground. So I think there's a really interesting things for liberal democratic states to think about in terms of what treaties might in time be needed. But I sit here worrying as they do. Let's be honest, we know what cyber sovereignty means. It means you control your cyberspace so you do not allow anybody else's content to go over and reach your citizens. That's what's meant by those states. I don't think that's a good answer.
Marcus, we've reached time, but if you could spare 30 seconds maybe to Irina's excellent question
Yes,
about the nexus.
The nexus. There are examples that have been publicly reported. Because everybody, the first point to say, I think, is if there's dangerous activity emanating from your territory, but by a non-state actor, like a cyber criminal group, who is causing massive worldwide damage through the use of ransomware, international law is quite clear. It is your responsibility. Whether you are colluding with them, directing them, sponsoring them, or just being told that that's happening from your state, there are responsibilities for you. But in this instance, we also, I'm talking about Russian-based cyber criminal groups here. There is clear evidence that they are at times colluding, evidence that they're doing operations timed remarkably closely to things that GRU do. There is evidence that they've got to certain places and then offered them up to the Russian government. So probably when I started writing the book, there were big question marks about the amount of Was it just turning a blind eye that the Russian state was doing, or was it more actively engaging with those criminal groups? And by the time I finished the book, the answer is the latter.
Marcus, thank you so much, not only just for an excellent presentation and fielding of these very good questions. I'd like to thank the audience for their excellent participation and engagement with the book. I encourage everyone to buy the book if you can, if you don't already have it. And I'd like you to join me in thanking Marcus and also applauding him from this very remarkable achievement. Thank you so much, Marcus.